Julian at Vienna. While Constantius was tied up in these difficult operations across the Euphrates, Julian at Vienna was occupied day and night in forming plans for the future, as far as his strained resources allowed. He was growing in confidence, but what he could not determine was whether he should try by every means to bring Constantius to an agreement, or seek to strike terror into him by getting his blow in first. Either course was hazardous. On the one hand, Constantius was likely to prove a grim friend, and on the other, he had generally emerged victorious in civil troubles. But what particularly exercised Julian was the example of his brother Gallus, who had been betrayed by his own ineptitude and the combined treachery and perjury of certain people. At moments, however, he braced himself to meet the urgent and complex situation, thinking it safer to show himself an open enemy, to one whose actions a wise man could infer from his past conduct, rather than to fall into a trap baited by a false show of friendship. So he paid little heed to the letter which Constantius had sent by Leonas, and recognised none of the promotions which Constantius had made except that of Nebridius. He held games like an emperor to celebrate 5 years of rule, and appeared in a magnificent diadem set with gleaming gems, whereas at the beginning of his reign he had taken and worn only a cheap crown, like the president of an athletic meeting dressed in purple. At this time, too, he sent the remains of his dead wife Helen to Rome, to be buried on his property near the city on the road to Nomentum, where her sister Constantina, once the wife of Gallus, was also buried. His desire to take the initiative against Constantius, now that Gaul was at peace, was sharpened and kindled by the inference that Constantius would shortly die. This he drew from various premonitionary signals, in the interpretation of which he was skilled, and from dreams. And since this learned prince, whose curiosity embraced all forms of knowledge, has been charged by his enemies with practising black arts to divine the future, we must briefly consider how a wise man may acquire this by no means unimportant branch of learning. The spirit which directs the eternal bodies that constitute the elements, and which is always and everywhere active in its work of foresight, allows us to share in the gift of divination through the knowledge that we pursue by various paths of learning, and the powers above, when they are propitiated by diverse rites, impart words of prophecy to mortal men from the waters, so to speak, of a never-failing spring. They are said to be presided over by the goddess Themis, who is so named because she makes known beforehand what is ordained by the fixed decrees of fate, which in Greek are called Thymia. And for this reason early theogonies give her a place in the bed and on the throne of Jove, the life-giving force. We do not owe auguries and auspices to the will of birds. They have no knowledge of the future, and no one would be such a fool as to say that they have. The truth is that their flight is directed by God, so that the noise of their beaks or the movement of their wings, whether gentle or violent, may show us what is to come. By these means a gracious deity loves to reveal impending events to men, either to reward their merits or out of pure affection for them. In the same way, those who inspect the entrails of beasts infer the course of events from the countless shapes which they take. There is a story that the discoverer of this form of knowledge was a man called Tages, who was seen to spring up suddenly from the ground somewhere in Etruria. Coming events are also revealed by a burning sensation in men's hearts, which results in prophetic words. The natural philosophers say that our minds are as it were sparks sent out by the sun, which is the mind of the universe, and that when they are kindled into flame they become aware of the future. Hence the Sibyls often say that their hearts burn within them, and that a great flame is consuming them. Much meaning too is to be found in the sound of the voices and in various signs which we encounter, as well as in thunder and lightning and in the flashing track of meteors. Our belief in dreams would be sure and unshakable were it not that their interpreters sometimes blunder. We are assured by Aristotle that dreams are certain and reliable when the dreamer is in a deep sleep, with the pupil of his eye looking straight before him and not directed to either side. Common folk in their foolishness sometimes ignorantly grumble and ask, if knowledge of the future is attainable, why do so-and-so not know what he would fall in battle of another man, that he would suffer this or that? To them it is enough to reply that even a grammarian is sometimes guilty of a solecism, that a musician is sometimes out of tune, and a medical man ignorant of a remedy. But we have not on that account abandoned grammar, music, and medicine. Cicero, among other fine sayings, has this: the gods give us signs of future events. If we go wrong about them, it is not the divinity but men's interpretation that is at fault. Now, not to digress too far and weary my reader, let me go back and set out the events which were foreseen. Julian's pretence of Christianity. While Julian was still at Paris in the position of Caesar, he was swinging his shield in various field exercises when the pins by which it was secured gave way, and he was left with only the handle, which he continued to hold in his strong grasp. There was general fright among those present at what seemed a bad omen, but Julian said, "Have no fear, I still have a firm grasp of what I held." Again, at Vienna, when he had gone to rest with a clear head, a shining form appeared to him at the dread hour of midnight, while he was half awake, and recited some Greek hexameters to him plainly several times. He relied on these as proof that he would have no further trouble. The lines were as follows: when Zeus crossed Aquarius's broad domain, and Kronos reached the 25th day of Virgo, then Constantius, Asia's king, shall end his life in pain and misery. So for the moment Julian left things unchanged and dealt calmly and quietly with such business as arose, gradually strengthening his position so that his rise in dignity should be matched by an increase in might. To frustrate any opposition and win universal goodwill, he pretended to adhere to the Christian religion, from which he had secretly apostatized long before. A few only were in his confidence, and knew that his heart was set on divination and augury, and all the other practices followed by the worshippers of the old gods. To conceal this for the time being, he went to church on the holy day which the Christians celebrate in January and call Epiphany, and departed after joining in their customary worship. Raid by Vadomar on the Ratian frontier, AD 361. During these events, and just as spring was at hand, Julian was startled by an unexpected piece of news which caused him sadness and grief. He heard that raiding parties of the Alemanni had set out from Vadomar's territory, a region from which no trouble was expected since the conclusion of the treaty, and were devastating the borders of Raetia, stopping at nothing, and ranging far and wide. To turn a blind eye to this would give occasion for a renewal of hostilities, so he sent Count Libino with the Celts and Petulantes, who were with him in winter quarters, to take such steps as were needed to rectify the situation. Libino quickly reached the neighbourhood of Sackingen, but was seen from a distance by the barbarians, who had hidden themselves in the valleys in preparation for a battle. urging on his men, who were spoiling for a fight in spite of their numerical inferiority. Libino rashly attacked the Germans and was himself the first to fall when battle was joined. His death raised the confidence of the barbarians and fired the Romans to avenge their leader. So an obstinate struggle ensued, in which our men succumbed to the pressure of numbers and were put to flight with slight losses in killed and wounded. Constantius, as I have already told, had made peace with this Vadomar and his brother, Gundamad, who was likewise king. Then after Gundamad's death, believing that Vadomar would be loyal to him, Constantius, if we are to believe an unsubstantiated rumour, entrusted him with the execution of a secret plan and sent him written orders to behave as if the peace were at an end and to fall upon the regions nearest to him. His idea was that this would deter Julian from abandoning the defence of Gaul. Vadomar, if the story is to be credited, committed these and similar outrages in obedience to Constantius's will. He had from his earliest youth been wonderfully adept at intrigue, as he showed later when he was governor of Phoenicia. But when the facts came to light, he desisted from his activities. A notary whom he had sent to Constantius was arrested by the sentries, and on examination a letter was found on him, in which, among other things, he had written, "Your Caesar is insubordinate." But when he wrote to Julian, he always addressed him as Lord, Augustus, and God. Vadomar arrested by Julian. In this dangerous and doubtful situation, which he thought might develop into a fatal disaster, Julian concentrated entirely on a single object. This was to lose no time in seizing Vadomar by force when he was off his guard, so as to ensure his own safety and that of the provinces. To this end he formed the following plan. He sent to those parts the notary Philgrius, afterwards Count of the East, whose judgment he trusted from previous experience, and among a number of other instructions which he was given to execute according to the exigencies of the situation, he gave him a sealed letter, which he was not to open or read unless Vadomar appeared on our side of the Rhine. Philagrius went as he was ordered, and when, after his arrival, he was occupied in business of various kinds, Vadomar crossed the river, behaving as if it were a time of profound peace, and he had nothing to fear and knew nothing of any untoward events. He visited the commander of the local troops and had a brief formal conversation with him. Then, in order that no suspicion should be aroused at his departure, he actually accepted an invitation to a banquet, at which Philagrius also was to be one of the guests. As soon as Philagrius came in and saw that the king, he recalled the emperor's instructions, and on the plea of urgent and serious business returned to his quarters, where he read the letter, learned what he was to do, and at once went back and took his place among the rest. At the end of this meal he read out his orders, placed Vadomar under arrest, and handed him over to the commanding officer to be placed in strict confinement at headquarters. Vadomar's attendants, about whom Philagrius had no instructions, were compelled to return to their homes. The king himself was taken to the emperor's camp. Hearing that the notary had been intercepted, he abandoned all hope of pardon, but Julian, without so much as reproaching him, sent him off to Spain. The object which Julian particularly wished to secure was that, when he left Gaul, this frightful man should not be at liberty to disturb the provinces which he had been at such pains to pacify. Julian's spirits were raised by his successes in arresting sooner than he had anticipated a king who caused him so much anxiety on the eve of his departure for far countries. He did not, however, slacken his efforts, but prepared to attack the barbarians who, as I have said, had slain Count Libino and some of his men in battle. to prevent their having notice of his approach and moving to a more remote spot. He crossed the Rhine at dead of night, with the lightest armed of his auxiliaries, and surrounded them when they were completely off their guard. They were aroused by the clash of their enemies' arms, and while they were groping for their swords and spears, Julian flew upon them and killed a number. Others who begged for mercy and offered to give up their booty he allowed to surrender. The rest who remained there were granted peace in return for a promise that they would cause no trouble in the future. Julian's address to his troops. During these energetic proceedings, Julian, realizing the dimensions of the civil strife he had aroused, and foreseeing with his usual sagacity that in a sudden coup nothing succeeds like speed, concluded that open revolt would be his safest course. He was doubtful, however, of the loyalty of his men, so after performing a secret rite to propitiate the goddess of war, he caused the trumpets to sound the assembly throughout his army, and taking his place on a stone platform, addressed them with obviously increased confidence in a louder voice than usual. Fellow soldiers, I am sure that in view of the great events that have occurred, you have been long looking forward in your hearts to this occasion, when consideration can be given to the events which we expect, and proper precautions taken. A soldier who is endured to great and glorious deeds does better to listen than to speak, and a leader of proved integrity should have no thoughts but such as can properly meet with praise and approval. So, without circumlocution, I will briefly before you say what I have in mind, and I beg you to give me your kind attention while I do so. When by the will of heaven I first came among you, a young and inexperienced man, I put an end to the frequent inroads of the Alemannian Franks and to their uninterrupted enjoyment of a license to plunder. By our joint efforts I made it possible for the armies of Rome to cross the Rhine at will, and I stood firm against clamorous reports and the armed aggression of strong tribes, relying on the sure foundation of your courage. The provinces of Gaul, which are now restored after so many disasters and so long a series of grave losses, have seen the labours we have undergone, and will hand down the story to posterity from generation to generation. But now that your imperative judgment and the needs of the times have raised me to the dignity of emperor, I have a loftier aim, which I hope to achieve with the help of God and yourselves, if fortune smiles upon our enterprise. I pride myself that in my relations with an army renowned for its good discipline and feats of arms, I have shown moderation and calm off the field, and prudence and caution in the frequent wars which we have waged against the united forces of foreign peoples. Now therefore follow what I believe to be the best course, and let us forestall any trouble that awaits us by the most intimate union of hearts. The general situation is favourable to our designs and wishes. When the regions of Illyricum are still without reinforcements, let us march unhindered and occupy the furthest parts of Dacia. Then we can consider, in the light of our success, what should be our next step. Have confidence in your commander, I beg you. Give your unwavering and faithful adherence to this plan, and confirm it by an oath. I, for my part, will do my utmost to see that there is no rashness or slackness, and if anyone requires it, I will pledge myself with a clear conscience never willingly to engage in any undertaking which is not in our common interest. One thing I beg and beseech you, see that none of you is carried away by the heat of the moment into inflicting harm on private persons. Bear in mind that the knowledge that the provinces have been kept safe and secure by your exemplary conduct has contributed as much to our glory as the countless defeats that we have inflicted upon our enemies. This speech by the emperor was received as if it were an oracle. The assembled troops were strongly moved and eager for a change. With one accord they raised terrifying shouts and clashed their shields with a frightful din, calling Julian a great and sublime leader, and, as they knew from experience, a successful conqueror of peoples and of kings. When they were told formally to take the oath of allegiance, they all held their swords to their throats and swore in set terms with fearful implications that they would undergo anything for him and even lay down their lives if needed. Their example was followed by the officers and all the close attendants of the emperor, who pledged their loyalty in similar terms. The only refusal came from Nebridius, who declared firmly but rashly that he could not by any means bind himself by an oath against Constantius, to whose kindness he was indebted for so many acts of favour. This so enraged the soldiers standing near that they set upon him and tried to kill him, but the emperor, at whose knees he had fallen, covered him with his cloak. When he returned to the palace, Julian found Nebridius, who had got there before him, prostrate on the ground and begging him to relieve his fears by giving him his hand. Julian answered, "If you touch my hand, I shall have no mark of distinction to confer on my friends. But go where you will, no one shall harm you." At these words, Nebridius withdrew in safety to his house in Tuscany. After these preliminary steps, which the importance of the matter in hand required, Julian, who knew from experience the value in troubled times of a preemptive strike, gave written orders for a march towards Pannonia, set his army with its standards in motion, and boldly committed himself to whatever fortune might bring. Constantius at Antioch. It is now time to retrace my steps and to give a brief account of Constantius' conduct of affairs, both domestic and military, while he was wintering at Antioch during these events in Gaul. When an emperor returns from abroad, a deputation of men of conspicuous distinction, which includes some prominent ex-tribunes, is appointed to greet him, and such a ceremonial reception took place on Constantius' arrival from Mesopotamia. An ex-tribune from Paphlagonia called Amphilochius, who there was good grounds for suspecting had sown the seeds of discord between the emperor's brothers when he was serving under Constans, had the audacity to present himself as if he had an equal right with the others to pay his respects. He was recognised and excluded amid loud shouts that he was a stubborn traitor who should no longer be allowed to see the light of day. Constantius, however, showed unusual mildness. "Do not," he said, "persecute a man who is, I believe, guilty, but who has not yet been clearly convicted. Remember that if he has committed any such crime, my presence will ensure that he is punished by the judgment of his own conscience, which he cannot evade." There the matter rested. On the next day in the circus, the same man was in his usual place opposite the emperor, when a sudden shout was raised at the beginning of a long-awaited event, and the railing on which he with a number of others was leaning gave way. They all fell to the ground, but, whereas the rest were only slightly hurt, Amphilochius suffered an internal injury and was found to have breathed his last. Constantius was overjoyed at this apparent confirmation of his ability to foresee the future. At the same time, he married a wife called Faustina. He had long since lost Eusebia, the sister of the ex-consul Eusebius and Hypatius, a woman of outstanding beauty and excellence of character, whose kindness of heart was unaffected by her high rank. It was by her well-deserved favour, as I have related, that Julian was rescued from danger and proclaimed Caesar. During this period, attention was also given to the position of Florentius, who had left Gaul through fear of the revolution. He was appointed to succeed Antonius, the Praetorian prefect of Illyricum, who had lately died, and the insignia of the highest magistracy were conferred on him together with Taurus, the Praetorian prefect of Italy. Even so, preparations for foreign and civil wars were pushed forward. The numbers of squadrons of cavalry were increased, and reinforcements for the legions enlisted with the same urgency. Levies were ordered throughout the provinces, and people of every rank and calling were harassed by requisitions of clothing, arms and engines of war, not to speak of gold and silver, stores of provisions of all sorts, and different kinds of pack animals. The King of Persia had been reluctantly obliged to return to his own country by the onset of winter, but it was feared that he would mount a more powerful attack when the weather became more open. Envoys were therefore sent with generous gifts to the kings and satraps beyond the Tigris to urge them to remain loyal to us and absent from any kind of intrigue or treachery. Above all, Arsaces and Meribanes, kings of Armenia and Iberia respectively, were wooed by splendid gifts of robes and presented many other kinds of gift, since it was feared that they could gravely injure the interests of Rome if at this critical moment they went over to the Persians. In the midst of these pressing affairs, Hermogenes died and was succeeded in the prefecture by Helpidius, a native of Paphlagonia. He was a man of mean appearance and no speaker, but straightforward and humane, so mild in fact that once, when Constantius ordered the torture of an innocent man, he calmly asked that he might be relieved of his office and the execution of the emperor's orders left to more suitable instruments of his will. Constantius in Mesopotamia. Constantius, perplexed by the difficulties which beset him, remained long in doubt whether he should attack Julian, who was still far away, or repel the Parthians, who were threatening to cross the Euphrates. At last, after frequent consultations with his generals, he decided to finish or at any rate stabilise the war which was nearer, and then, leaving no enemy to fear behind him, to traverse Illyricum and Italy in the expectation of running down Julian like a hunted animal at the very beginning of his enterprise. This was what he kept declaring to soothe the fears of his men. But to keep things on the boil and avoid any appearance of neglecting the war on the other front, and to spread the terror of his coming in all parts, by giving the impression that he was on his way from the east, he sent the notary Gaudentius by sea to Africa, which he feared might be invaded in his absence. Africa is a region of importance to emperors in any circumstances, and Gaudentius, as I have indicated earlier, had spent some time in Gaul, keeping an eye on the activities of Julian. Constantius had a double reason for hoping that Gaudentius would be prompt and obedient in the discharge of his mission. First, because he feared the other side, which he had offended, and second, because he would be eager to seize this chance of ingratiating himself with Constantius, of whose ultimate victory he had no doubt, an opinion at that time confidently shared by everybody. On his arrival, Gaudentius, having informed Count Cretio and the other commanders of what was on foot, in accordance with the emperor's orders, assembled the best troops from all parts, transferred light-armed skirmishers from both provinces of Mauritania, and kept the closest guard on the coast opposite Aquitaine and Italy. Constantius' adoption of this policy was justified by the fact that while he was alive none of his enemies reached these shores, although the coast of Sicily from Marsellia to Cape Passaro was occupied by a strong force ready to cross at once if they got the chance. When Constantius had arranged these and other less important matters to what he thought the best advantage, he was informed by messengers and letters from his generals that the proud king of Persia had mobilized his forces and was encamped near the banks of the Tigris, though the precise point where he intended to break through was unknown. Stung by this news and thinking that he could best anticipate the coming offensive if he were nearer the theatre of war, Constantius concentrated his cavalry and the flower of his infantry, on which he relied, left his winter quarters at the earliest possible moment, crossed the Euphrates on a bridge of boats at Cape and made for Edessa, a well-supplied and strongly fortified city, where he waited for a time until scouts or deserters should bring him news of the enemy's movements. Julian on the march. Meanwhile, Julian, after disposing of the business I have mentioned, left August. He sent Sallustius, who was promoted to the rank of prefect, back to Gaul and appointed Germanian to succeed Nebridius. At the same time, he made Navita master of cavalry, distrusting the old traitor Gemorius, who he was told had betrayed his own emperor Vetranio when he was in command of the Scutari. Jovius, whom I have mentioned in my account of Magnentius, was appointed questor, and Mamertinus placed in charge of the treasury. De Galliff was put in command of the household troops, and a number of others of approved merit and loyalty were appointed to various military posts. Julian intended to march through the Black Forest and along the roads near the Danube, but the suddenness with which events had developed gave him pause. He was afraid that his appearance with only a small following might appear contemptible, and that he might have to encounter the resistance of a large number. To forestall this danger, he devised a clever plan. He divided his army and sent part under Jovianus and Jovius to make a rapid march over the familiar roads of Italy, while the rest, under the cavalry commander Navita, were to advance through the middle of Rhaetia. By being dispersed in this way over different regions, they would give the impression of vast numbers and spread alarm everywhere, a strategy employed by Alexander the Great and a number of other skillful generals after him, when circumstances required it. Orders were given that from the very start they should proceed cautiously and be ready to meet an enemy at any moment. At night they were to post sentries and keep watch to avoid any danger of being surprised. Collapse of opposition to Julian. After making these dispositions according to his best judgment, Julian marched forward as he had often done in penetrating barbarian country, relying on the unbroken series of his successes. Reaching a place below which he was told that the river was navigable, he embarked on boats, which he was lucky enough to find in considerable numbers, and was carried downstream without attracting much notice. This was possible because he was inured to hardship, and having no need of luxuries but being able to make do with a scanty supply of ordinary food, could pass towns and fortresses without stopping. In this he exemplified the fine saying of the old King Cyrus, who, when he was asked by his host what food he should get ready, replied, "Only bread, for I hope to dine near a stream." Rumour, however, whose 1,000 tongues wonderfully exaggerates the truth, spread throughout Illyricum the report that Julian, puffed up with his successes in defeating a host of kings and people in Gaul, was now approaching with a numerous army. This so terrified the Praetorian prefect Taurus that he made a hasty retreat as if in the face of a foreign foe. He availed himself of the quick relays of the public post service to cross the Julian Alps, taking with him at the same time the prefect Florentius. Count Lucilian, however, who then commanded in those parts with his headquarters at Sirmium, was alarmed by some slight intelligence of Julian's movements. Acting on this, he collected such troops as he could get together at short notice and prepared to oppose Julian's advance. But Julian rushed like a fireball or a blazing dart straight to his goal. The moon was waning, and the greater part of the night consequently dark, when he reached Bononia, 19 miles from Sirmium. There he unexpectedly landed, and at once sent De Galliff with some light-armed men to summon Lucilian, and to bring him by force if he offered resistance. The latter was still asleep when he was aroused by a confused noise, and found himself surrounded by a ring of unknown men. Realizing what had happened, and overawed by the imperial title, he most reluctantly obeyed the order. So the man who a moment before had been a proud and spirited commander now had to bow to another's will. He was mounted on the first beast that came to hand and brought to the emperor as a wretched prisoner, almost out of his wits with fright. But as soon as he saw Julian and realized that he was to be given an opportunity of doing homage to the purple, he pulled himself together in the knowledge that he was safe. "It is rash and reckless of your majesty," he said, "to venture with a few men into another's territory." Julian answered with a bitter smile, "Keep these wise words for Constantius. I have allowed you to touch my imperial robe not because I need your advice, but to allay your fears." Surrender of Sirmium and seizure of Saki. After disposing of Lucilian, Julian, thinking that nothing was to be gained by delay or inaction, and behaving with his usual boldness and confidence at a moment of danger, advanced at speed towards the city, counting on its surrender. As he approached its large and extensive suburbs, he was met with lights and flowers and good wishes by a heterogeneous crowd of soldiers and others, who greeted him as Augustus and Lord and escorted him into the palace. Delighted by this success, which he regarded as an omen that his hopes would be fulfilled, and that the example of so famous and populous a metropolitan area would ensure his reception as a saviour from heaven in the other cities also, he gratified the populace by devoting the next day to chariot races, but his impatience was such that when the third day dawned he marched out along the public highway and seized Saki without opposition. A garrison under the loyal Navita was posted to guard it, and this will be a convenient moment to describe the nature of the place. The adjacent high ranges of Haemus and Rhodope, the former of which rises from the very bank of the Danube and the latter from the nearer side of the river Vardar, leave between their swelling hills a narrow pass which separates Illyricum from Thrace. It overlooks large and famous cities on both sides. On one side Sophia in the heart of Dacia, and on the other Philippopolis in Thrace. It is as if nature foresaw that the surrounding peoples must come under the rule of Rome and purposely contrived a gap, which originally opened obscurely between close-set hills, but in our great and glorious later days has been made passable even by carriages, and has on occasion been blocked so effectively as to repel the attacks of great generals and peoples. The side which faces Illyricum has a gentle slope and is often easily surmounted, and one might almost say caught napping. But the side which commands Thrace falls sheer down. Rough paths on either hand make hard going, and the ascent is difficult even when unopposed. At the foot of these heights on both sides is a wide extent of plain, which on the upper side stretches as far as the Julian Alps, while on the lower the ground is so flat and open that it presents no obstacle to habitation as far as the Straits and the Sea of Marmara. After dealing with this urgent matter, the emperor left the master of the horse at Saki and returned to Nis, a prosperous town from which he could without hindrance make such dispositions as would suit him. He had seen the historian Victor at Sirmium and had now sent for him, appointed him governor of Lower Pannonia with the rank of consular, and awarded him the honour of a bronze statue. Victor was a man who was a model of respectability and long afterwards was urban prefect. Julian, whose ambition now took a higher flight and who believed that there was no possibility of receiving an accord with Constantius, sent a bitter letter reviling him to the Senate. In this he set out Constantius' faults and made certain specific charges. It was read in the Senate House while Tertullus was still prefect. The nobility gave a fine example of self-confidence and generous feeling by shouting unanimously, "We expect you to show respect to the man who has made you what you are." On this occasion, Julian attacked the reputation of Constantine also by describing him as an innovator and a destroyer of hallowed laws and traditions, and openly reproached him for being the first to promote barbarians to the honour of the consulship. This was a tasteless and irresponsible act on the part of Julian, who, instead of studying to avoid the very fault which he so hotly reprobated, shortly afterwards made Navita the colleague of Marcellinus in the consulship. Navita, so far from being the equal in distinction, experience, and renown of those on whom Constantine had conferred the highest magistracy, was uncultivated and rather boorish, and, what was even less tolerable, cruel in the conduct of his high office. Seizure of Aquileia on Constantius' behalf. While Julian's attention was occupied by these important and worrying affairs, he received unexpected and alarming news of a monstrous plot hatched by certain persons, which would impede his dashing progress unless it were promptly nipped in the bud. I will give a brief account of this. Julian had found at Sirmium 2 of Constantius' legions and a cohort of archers, of whose loyalty he entertained doubts. He therefore dispatched them to Gaul on the pretext that they were urgently needed there. Dreading the prospect of the long march and of the fierce and persistent hostility of the Germans, they moved slowly with mutiny in mind. In this they were prompted and abetted by Nigrinius, a native of Mesopotamia, who commanded a squadron of cavalry. The plot was matured in clandestine meetings and kept a profound secret. When they reached Aquileia, a prosperous city fortified by strong walls, they suddenly closed the gates, an act of defiance in which they were supported by the native population, which was still overawed by the name of Constantius. They blockaded the entrances, posted armed men on the towers and ramparts, and made preparations for a coming struggle. In the meantime they lived a free and easy life, and their daring actions encouraged the Italians around them to espouse the cause of Constantius, whom they supposed to still be alive. Siege and surrender of Aquileia. Julian received this news while he was still at Nice, and free from any apprehension of a hostile movement in his rear. He had heard and read that Aquileia was a city which had survived several sieges without ever being destroyed or surrendered, and this made him the more eager to win it either by stratagem or by the arts of diplomacy before anything worse happened. So he ordered the master of cavalry, Jovinus, who was advancing over the Alps and had entered Noricum, to return at once and find some means of extinguishing the conflagration which had broken out. Also, to leave nothing undone, he gave instructions that any household or legionary troop that passed through Nice should be kept there to render what help they could. Shortly after making these arrangements, he heard of the death of Constantius, and crossed Thrace and entered Constantinople. There he learned from several sources that the siege of Aquileia would take time but need cause no anxiety. He therefore assigned Imo with some other members of his staff to the task, and transferred Jovianus to deal with more pressing problems elsewhere. Once a double line of heavy infantry had been drawn around Aquileia, the generals were unanimous in thinking that it would be best to induce its defenders to surrender by a mixture of threats and fair words, but several exchanges served only to harden the resolution of the besieged, and negotiations were broken off without result. There was nothing for it now but battle. Both sides recruited their strength with food and sleep, and at dawn were roused by the trumpets to the business of mutual slaughter, which they set about with loud shouts and more spirit than discretion. The attackers pushing in front of them penthouses and closely woven hurdles, advanced slowly and cautiously, and tried to undermine the walls with a multitude of iron tools. Many carried ladders made to match the height of the walls, but when they had all but reached them, some were thrown down and crushed by a hail of stones, and others transfixed by whistling darts. The resultant retreat carried with it all the rest, whose ardour for the fight was dampened by fear of meeting a similar fate. This first encounter raised the spirits of the besieged and encouraged them to hope for further successes and to think that what remained to be done was comparatively easy. Full of confidence, they placed engines in suitable positions and, without relaxing their efforts, kept up their watch-keeping and the other precautions necessary for their safety. The engineers on the other side, although alarmed by the dangers which faced them, were ashamed to appear slack or inactive, and seeing that a frontal assault had met with so little success, transferred their efforts to the methods of a regular siege. Since the river Natesio, which flows close by the city, left no space suitable for the deployment of rams and other engines or for digging mines, a device was adopted as admirable as anything contrived in olden times. Without a moment's delay, wooden towers were constructed high enough to overtop the enemy's ramparts, and each of these was placed on a platform made by fastening 3 ships tightly together. The tops of the towers were occupied by men-at-arms whose united efforts were to dislodge the opposition in a hand-to-hand fight, while at a lower level light-armed troops issued from the bowels of the towers and tried to cross on small portable bridges which they had put together for the purpose. The idea behind this joint operation was that while the 2 parties above were exchanging a fire of missiles and stones, those who had crossed by the bridges should effect a breach in the city without interference, and open a way into the heart of the city through the city wall. This clever plan, however, came to nothing. As the towers approached, they were showered with fire darts soaked in pitch as well as with reeds and brushwood and various other combustibles, and the rapid spread of the flames, combined with the weight of the men who had a precarious footing on them, caused them to totter and fall into the river. Some of the men on the tops were killed by shot from catapults. The troops on foot, left in the lurch by the disaster of their friends on the ships, were crushed by huge stones, except for a few who saved themselves by their speed in spite of the obstacles in their path. Finally, when the fight had lasted until evening, the usual order was given to break off, and the 2 sides parted and passed the rest of the day with very different feelings. The doleful cries of the besiegers, lamenting the deaths of their comrades, encouraged their opponents to hope that they would get the upper hand, though they too had a few losses to mourn. Nevertheless, there was no relaxation of effort. 1 whole night was allowed to restore the men's energy with food and rest, but at dawn the trumpet roused them to the fight, and it was renewed. Some held their shields above their heads to facilitate their movement, others rushed forward with ladders on their shoulders as before, and all exposed their breasts to every kind of weapon. A number tried to break the iron bars of the gates, and were themselves attacked with fire or perished under a shower of stones from the walls, yet others who made a bold attempt to cross the ditch were taken at a disadvantage by the sudden emergence of men from posterns, and either paid for their rashness with their lives or withdrew wounded. Their opponents had a safe line of retreat, and while they were lying in wait were completely sheltered by a turf-covered rampart in front of the wall. Although the besieged, who relied solely on their fortifications, showed great endurance and skill in the arts of war, a picked force of their opponents, chafing at the long delay, carefully surveyed the entire environs in the hope of finding a spot where they could force a way into the city, either by direct assault or by their artillery. But when the difficulties proved insuperable, they began to prosecute the siege with less energy. Those in reserve, leaving only sentries and pickets on duty, took to plundering the country about, which was rich in supplies of every kind. Most of the loot they had gathered they shared with their comrades, and overindulgence in stuffing and drinking led to a loss of morale. When Julian, who was still at Constantinople for the winter, heard from Imo and his colleagues what had happened, he hit on a shrewd way of rectifying the situation and sent the infantry commander Agillo to Aquileia. Agillo at that time had a great reputation, and it was hoped that the sight of so famous a man and the news which he brought of the death of Constantius would bring the siege to an end. Meanwhile, since other methods had failed, it was decided to keep up the siege of Aquileia and to overcome the fierce resistance of its defenders by forcing them to surrender through first. The aqueducts were cut, but this had no effect on the confidence of the besieged, so with enormous effort the course of the river was diverted. Even this was unsuccessful. Though they no longer had a plentiful supply of drinking water, the men who had shut themselves up in the town by their own foolhardiness made do with the scanty amount they could get from the wells. While this was happening, with the result I have mentioned, Agillo appeared on the scene in accordance with his orders. He approached the walls boldly, protected by a thick screen of shields, but his detailed and true account of the death of Constantius and of the establishment of Julian as emperor was rejected with contempt as a pack of lies. No one believed his statements until he was admitted alone to one of the battalions under a safe conduct and confirmed what he had told them by a solemn oath. Then the inhabitants, overjoyed at their release from their long agony, flung open the gates and poured out to greet the general who brought them peace. They excused themselves by representing Nigrinus and a few others as the authors of their mad act, and begged that the execution of these men would suffice to wipe out the guilt of treason and the woes of the city. A few days later, after a strict inquiry before the praetorian prefect Mamertinus, Nigrinus was burned at the stake as primarily responsible for the war. After him, 2 members of the town council, Romulus and Sebastius, were convicted of having recklessly sown the seeds of discord and suffered capital punishment. All the rest who had engaged in this mad conflict from compulsion rather than inclination escaped unharmed. Such was the equitable decision arrived at by the emperor, who was merciful and not hard to appease. But all this happened later. While Julian was still at Nice, he had serious grounds for fearing that he might have to face dangers on both sides. Behind him, a sudden attack by the troops besieged at Aquileia might shut the passes of the Julian Alps and deprive him of provinces from which he expected support at the moment. At the same time, he was greatly alarmed by the strength of the East. He heard that the forces dispersed over Thrace had been quickly concentrated in the face of his sudden threat and were approaching the neighbourhood of Saki under the command of Count Marcian. Nevertheless, he took actions on his own part, proportionate to the urgency of the problems, and brought together the army of Illyricum, which was injured to the dust of war, and ready to follow a bold leader into battle. In spite of his critical situation, he did not overlook the interests of individuals and heard a number of suits, especially those which concerned holders of municipal office, whom he was already disposed to favour, and many of whom he invested with public posts above their deserts. He found at Nice 2 distinguished senators, Symmachus and Maximus, who had been sent by their colleagues on a mission to Constantius and were on their way back. He gave them a gracious reception, and passing over the better man, appointed Maximus prefect of the Eternal City, in succession to Tertullus. This man was to gratify Rufinus Volcatius, whose nephew he knew Maximus to be. Under Maximus' administration there was plenty of food, and the usual frequent murmurings of the populace died down. At this time, too, to inspire confidence at a moment of crisis and encourage his loyal supporters, he nominated Marcellinus, the praetorian prefect of Illyricum, to the consulship with Navita as his colleague, although he had lately reproached Constantine in unmeasured terms for being the first to promote barbarians of low birth. Retreat of Sapor. While Julian was thus occupied with new projects in a mood between hope and fear, Constantius at Edessa was disturbed by differing reports from his scouts. He was torn between two incompatible courses of action. At one moment he was preparing his forces for a pitched battle, and at the next contemplating if opportunity offered a second siege of Besabdi, believing with justice that he should not leave his Mesopotamian flank unprotected during the offensive which he was about to mount in the north. Various causes contributed to protract his state of indecision. King Sapor was lingering on the far side of the Tigris, waiting to move until the omens were favourable. If he were to cross the river unopposed, he could easily break through to the Euphrates. Another consideration was that Constantius, who had to keep his troops in condition for a civil war, was nervous of exposing them to the perils of a siege, knowing from experience the strength of the fortifications and the energy of the defence. To keep things on the move, however, and to avoid any charge of inaction, he put into the field strong columns under Arbitio and Agillo, the masters of the cavalry and infantry, not to provoke the Persians to battle, but to be deployed along our bank of the Tigris and watch to see in what direction their fierce monarch would break out. He gave them both oral and written orders that if the enemy host should begin to cross, they must at once withdraw. While these generals were guarding the front assigned to them and trying to read the hidden intentions of that most subtle of all peoples, Constantius himself kept the greatest part of his army in a state of alert, and made occasional sallies to protect the neighbouring towns. From time to time, scouts and deserters brought him inconsistent reports. They could not give him any clear forecast because among the Persians knowledge of what is planned is confined to the grandees, who can be trusted not to reveal it, and who worship silence as if it were a god. The generals in the field incessantly sent to the emperor with requests for reinforcements and asserted that only a concentration of the whole army could withstand the assault of the ambitious king. During this anxious time, there arrived in quick succession indubitably authentic reports that Julian, after a lightning march through Italy and Illyricum, had seized the pass of Saki and was only waiting for the auxiliaries, which he had summoned from every quarter, to invade Thrace with an armed host. The news plunged Constantius in grief. His only comfort was that he had always come off best in civil wars. The situation made it very difficult to form a plan, but he decided that the best course was to use the public post service to send relays of troops ahead of him to meet this fearful threat as soon as possible. This met with unanimous approval, and light-armed men set out in accordance with his orders, but on the next day Constantius heard that King Sapor and all his forces had returned home, because bad auspices compelled him to abandon his enterprise. This relieved Constantius' anxiety. He recalled all the troops except those normally stationed in Mesopotamia, and returned at once to Hierapolis. Once the army was concentrated, Constantius, uncertain of the ultimate outcome, assembled by trumpet call all the centuries, maniples, and cohorts. When they had crowned on the field the emperor, to impress on them the necessity of prompt obedience, he took his place on a high platform surrounded by a larger suite than usual, and addressed them with a show of calm and confidence as follows. I have always made it my aim to avoid any careless words or actions inconsistent with strict honour. Like a cautious pilot, I have put my helm up and down in accordance with the motion of the waves. Now, however, my loving subjects, I have to confess a mistake, or to use a truer word, an act of kindness, which I believed would serve the interests of the state. Give me a favourable hearing, I beg you, while I explain in simple terms my reasons for convoking this assembly. While Magnentius, whom your valour overthrew, was pursuing his mischievous course, I raised my cousin Gallus to the dignity of Caesar and sent him to defend the East. He swerved from the path of justice by many crimes as hateful to relate as to behold, and was punished by the judgment of the law. If only Nemesis, that arch contriver of trouble, had been content with that, and had left me to recall in anguish but at peace no more than a single past sorrow. But now a second has fallen on me more grievous. I might well say that the first, for which, however, your native courage will, with the help of heaven, provide a remedy. Julian, to whom, while you were fighting the foreign peoples threatening Illyricum, I entrusted the defence of Gaul, has become so madly presumptuous on the score of some trivial victories over half-armed Germans as to recruit from his auxiliaries for an ambitious design against the state a small band of desperadoes who will stick at nothing. He has trampled underfoot the rule of law, the nursing mother of the Roman world, which I am confident from my own experience and from the lessons of the past will take vengeance on his criminal acts and reduce his pride to ashes. What course, then, is left but to meet the storm that has been raised and to act with speed to crush this mad rebellion before it gathers strength? I have no doubt that with the very present help of God Most High, under whose eternal judgment the ungrateful stand condemned, these men who, so far from being provoked, have conspired to destroy the innocent after being loaded with favours, will find the sword that they have wickedly drawn turned to their own destruction. Rest assured, I forecast it with confidence, and it accords with the promises that justice will help the righteous, that when we come to close quarters our enemies will be too numb with panic to face the fire flashing from your eyes, or the first note of your war cry. This speech won them all to his side. Brandishing their spears angrily, they expressed much sympathy for Constantius and demanded to be led forthwith against the rebel. Their favourable response changed the emperor's fear into joy. Dismissing the assembly, he ordered Arbitio, with whom unrivalled success in quelling civil wars he had been well acquainted, to go ahead of him with the lancers and mariri and some companies of light-armed troops. Gornorius likewise was sent on with the laity to oppose the enemy's advance at the pass of Saki. He was chosen because he had a grudge against Julian for the contemptuous treatment that he had received in Gaul. Omens of Constantius' death. In this storm of trouble, Constantius' fortunes began to falter and decline, and it became plain from omens almost as clear as words that the crisis of his life was at hand. He was disturbed by a vision in the night. Before he was quite asleep, he saw his father's spirit holding out to him a fine child. He took it and placed it in his lap, where it shook from his grasp and threw to a distance the orb which he was carrying in his right hand. This was a sign of an approaching political upheaval, although the soothsayers gave it a favourable interpretation. Later he admitted to his closest confidences that he felt abandoned because he could no longer see a mysterious something which he thought dimly appeared to him from time to time. This he believed to be a guardian angel appointed to protect him, and its departure to be a sign that he was about to leave this world. Divines believed that a particular spirit of this kind is assigned to every man at birth to direct his course, as far as the decrees of fate permit, but that it is visible to very few, in fact only to those of unusual merit. This is the teaching of oracles of eminent writers, among them the comic poet Meander, whose works contain the following couplet: "A spirit goes along with every man from birth to guide him on the path of life." Similarly, we are given to understand by the immortal poems of Homer that it was not the gods of Olympus who spoke to the heroes and stood by them and helped them in battle, but the familiar spirits which belonged to them. We are told that it was by these particular spirits' support that Pythagoras and Socrates and Numa Pompilius became famous, not to mention the elder Scipio and, as some believe, Marius and Octavian, who was the first to bear the title of Augustus. There are also Hermes and Apollonius and Plotius, the last of whom was bold enough to write on the esoteric subject and to demonstrate by profound reasoning how it came about that these spirits are joined to the souls of men and nurse them as if they were their bosom as long as fate allows, initiating them into higher truths if they find that they are pure and have kept themselves spotless and free from the pollution of sin during their association with the body. Constantius dies at Mobsocrina in Cilicia. Constantius made a rapid return to Antioch, eager as always to meet the challenge of civil war head-on. When all was ready, he was in excessive haste to march, and although many of his officials murmured against his decision, no one dared to dissuade or oppose him openly. Autumn was already far advanced when he set out. In a suburb called Hippocephalus, 3 miles from the city, he saw in broad daylight on the right of the road the headless corpse of a murdered man lying with its feet towards the west. In spite of his alarm at this omen of his approaching end, he persisted in pushing on and reached Tarsus, where he contracted a slight fever. Believing that the motion of the journey would help him to shake off the indisposition, he pushed on his way over difficult country to Mobescarina, which lies at the foot of Mount Tarsus and is the last post station in Cilicia you come from here. Next day he tried to go on, but was prevented by the worsening of his condition. The fever in his veins gradually reached such a height that his body burned like a furnace, and he was too hot to touch. Being now past all medical aid, and at his last gasp, he began to lament his death, and we are told that while he was still in possession of his senses, he named Julian as his successor. At his last struggle for breath, he fell silent, and finally, after a long agony, departed this life on the 5th of October. He was 44 and a few months old, and had reigned for 38 years. After the last solemn call to the deceased and an outburst of lamentation and grief, the highest officials of the court debated what course to take. A few tentative suggestions were made privately that they should choose a new emperor. The proposal is said to have emanated from Eusebius, who was driven to it by consciousness of guilt. Seeing, however, that any attempt at such a revolution would be frustrated by the near approach of Julian, Theolaeth and Abigild, who were then counts, were sent to him to inform him of the death of his cousin and to beg him to come without delay and take possession of the East, which was ready to obey him. Unconfirmed rumour had it that Constantius had left a will in which, as I said, he made Julian his heir and gave trusts and legacies to his nearest friends. His wife was with child when he died, and his posthumous daughter was called after him, and when she grew up was married to Gratian. The good and bad qualities of Constantius. I propose to draw a clear distinction between Constantius' good and bad qualities, and it will be convenient to deal first with the former. He always maintained the dignity of his position as emperor, and thought it beneath him to court popularity. He was exceedingly sparing in his conferment of higher honours. With a few exceptions, he allowed no change which would increase the prestige of his administrators, and he never let the military set themselves up too high. Under him, no general was advanced to the highest rank of nobility. As far as my memory serves, generals were only of the second grade. A master of cavalry was never given an official reception by the governor of his province, and was not allowed any share in civil administration. All officials, both civil and military, looked up to the praetorian prefect with traditional respect as the holder of the highest of all offices. In handling his army, Constantius was exceptionally careful and sometimes overly critical in his scrutiny of men's merits. Appointments at court were regulated with scrupulous exactness. No unknown newcomer to the palace was ever entrusted with an important function, and anyone who was to be master of the offices, or treasurer, or anything of that sort, rose to this only after giving thorough evidence of his quality during 10 years' service in other posts. It very rarely happened that a military man was transferred to a civil office, and conversely, only experienced veterans were placed in command of troops. Constantius was industrious and had aspirations to learning, but he was too dull-witted to make a speaker, and when he turned his mind to versifying, he produced nothing worthwhile. His style of living was frugal and temperate, and he ate and drank only in moderation. In consequence, his health was so robust that he was rarely unwell, although such illnesses as he had were dangerous. Long experience confirms medical opinion that this is what happens when people keep clear of dissipation and luxury. When necessary, he could do with little sleep, and for long periods of his life he was so exceptionally chaste that even his most confidential servants could not so much as suspect him of behaviour which malice invents in those who enjoy the freedom of supreme power, even when it can find no grounds for it. In riding, throwing the javelin, and above all in archery, as well as in the various skills of the infantry, he was thoroughly expert. I will not dwell, because it has been related so often, on the fact that he was never seen in public wiping his face or nose or spitting, or turning his head to either side, and that he never in his life tasted fruit. After picking out his good qualities, as far as I could ascertain them, I turn to a description of his deficits. Although in most respects he was comparable with other emperors of average merit, yet if he discovered any ground, however false or slight, for suspecting an attempt upon the throne, he showed in endless investigations, regardless of right or wrong, a cruelty which easily surpassed that of Caligula or Domitian or Commodus. Indeed, at the very beginning of his reign he rivalled their barbarity by destroying root and branch all who were connected with him by blood and birth. The sufferings of the wretched men accused of infighting or violating his prerogative were increased by the bitter and angry suspicions nourished by the emperor in all such cases. Once he got wind of anything of this kind, he threw himself into its investigation with unbecoming eagerness, and appointed merciless judges to preside over such trials. In the infliction of punishments, he sometimes tried to prolong the agonies of death, if the victim's constitution could stand it, and showed himself in this respect more savage even than Gallienus. That emperor was the object of many genuine plots by rebels such as Aurelius Posthumus, Ingenius, and Valens, and several others, yet on some occasions he punished capital crimes more mildly than they deserved. Constantius, on the other hand, employed excessive tortures to give the appearance of authenticity to circumstances which were invented or at best uncertain. In such cases he showed himself the deadly enemy of justice, although his great objective was to be thought of as just and merciful. He was adept at making a mountain out of a molehill of evidence, just as sparks from a dry wood can be fanned by even the slightest breeze into a fire which rushes with irreversible violence on the surrounding countryside. In this he was the antithesis of that blameless Emperor Marcus. The latter was engaged in a campaign in Illyricum when Cassius usurped the imperial title in Syria, and a bundle of Cassius' letters to his accomplices fell into his hands by the capture of their bearer. Marcus at once ordered the package to be burned unopened, in order that he might not know the names of the plotters and be forced against his will to regard certain people as his enemies. Many right-thinking men believed that it would have been much better for Constantius' reputation to renounce his power without bloodshed, instead of using such cruel methods to defend it. The same lesson is enforced by Cicero in a letter to Nepos, in which he reprobates the cruelty of Caesar. Happiness, he writes, is nothing but success in noble actions, or, in other words, the good fortune that brings worthy aims to fruition. The man who has no such aims cannot be happy. It follows that no happiness was to be found in the wicked and criminal designs nursed by Caesar. In my opinion, Camillus was happier in exile than Manlius would have been in the same period if he had achieved that object of his wishes and made himself king. Heraclitus of Ephesus teaches the same truth when he tells us that, though the changes and chances of life have sometimes put outstanding men at the mercy of weaklings and cowards, the truest glory is won when a man in power totally subdues his cruel and savage and angry impulses, and erects in the citadel of his soul a splendid memorial to his victory over himself. Constantius, though he suffered grievous defeats in foreign wars, prided himself on his successes in civil conflicts, and bathed in the blood which poured in a fearful stream from the internal wounds of the state. Perverting the normal and honourable grounds for such an action, he erected triumphal arches in Gaul and Pannonia at great expense to commemorate the ruin of the provinces, and inscribed on them the record of his deeds for men to read of him as long as the monuments should last. He was excessively influenced by his wives and the shrill eunuchs and certain court officials, who applauded his every word and were on the watch for opportunities to agree with whatever he asserted or denied. The sorrows of the age were increased by the insatiable greed of the tax collectors, whose exactions earned Constantius more hatred than revenue. What made the situation seem even less tolerable in the eyes of many was that he never heard a tax case himself or took any steps to alleviate the burdens of the provinces, which were crushed by a multiplicity of dues and imposts. Moreover, he never found it difficult to take away what he had previously granted. The plain and simple religion of the Christians was believed by Constantius with old wives' fancies. Instead of trying to settle matters, he raised complicated issues which led to much dissension, and as this spread more widely, he fed it with verbal argument. Public transport hurried throngs of bishops hither and thither to attend what they call synods, and by his attempts to impose conformity, Constantius only succeeded in hamstringing the post service. As to his appearance and build, he was rather dark, with staring eyes and sharp sight. His hair was soft, and his cheeks regularly shaved to give him a trim, shining look. From the base of his neck to the groin his body was unusually long, but his legs were very short and bowed, which made him a good runner and jumper. The body of the dead emperor was washed and placed in a coffin, and Jovian, who was still only a staff officer, was ordered to convey it in royal state to Constantinople to be buried with his family. As he was sitting in the vehicle which carried the remains, Jovian was treated in a way usually reserved for emperors. Samples of the soldiers' rations, which they call tastes, were presented to him, and the animals of the post-service paraded, while the people thronged about him as they commonly do. These and other things of the sort were a sign that imperial power would come to Jovian, though only in an empty and shadowy form, since they occurred while he was directing a funeral procession.